What if I told you that one of the most shocking family betrayals in the British monarchy's modern history had just unfolded? That a plea for help, a desperate, almost heart-wrenching request, was met with a wall of silence. Imagine being Prince Harry, a man who has faced the harshest glare of public scrutiny, now confronting a personal storm more intimate than any press headline could capture. And then imagine the one person you thought would be your lifeline, your own brother, blocking your call, shutting the door on you at the very moment you needed family the most. That's exactly what happened in the wake of Meghan Markle's divorce filing. And the details are far more explosive than anything the tabloids have dared hint at so far. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all started with a routine phone call, or at least, what Harry thought would be routine. He wasn't asking for $1 million bailout or public vindication. He simply wanted a place to stay in the United Kingdom. After months of tension, media scrutiny, and legal wrangling, Harry reached out, hoping that family loyalty would trump palace politics. But the response he received was anything but comforting. It wasn't just a refusal, it was a calculated block. His call didn't just go unanswered. It was intercepted, redirected, and quietly dismissed. Imagine that. A brother, a confidant, someone who shared childhood memories, birthdays, and inside jokes, refusing to open the door. Why would William do this? Was it loyalty to protocol over blood? Was it fear of media fallout? Or was it a more calculated move, one designed to protect the crown at all costs? This is the story of that moment, a story full of heartbreak, tension, and drama that feels ripped from a cinematic script but is all too real. To understand why this incident matters, you have to rewind a little. The British royal family has never been strangers to drama. From Queen Victoria's family squabbles to the turbulent reigns of George IV and Edward VIII, conflict has always simmered behind palace walls. But the modern monarchy is different. Today, every argument, every emotional fracture is scrutinized, dissected, and broadcast to millions. Social media magnifies every whisper. A single phone call can spiral into a public spectacle. And for Harry and Meghan, who have already been at the center of relentless media attention, this moment wasn't just personal, it was explosive. Consider Harry's position. He's not just a prince. He's a man trapped between duty and desire, between loyalty to the institution that raised him and the family he chose to build, between the memory of his mother, Princess Diana, and the reality of his current life, filled with responsibilities, pressures, and expectations. For him, reaching out to William wasn't just a request for shelter. It was an emotional lifeline. And being blocked? That's more than a rejection. It's a wound that cuts deep, the kind that doesn't just sting for a day but echoes for months, even years. And what about Meghan? Her divorce filing didn't just trigger legal consequences. It ignited a chain reaction of emotional and relational tremors. The filing was sudden to the public, but insiders suggest it had been in the works for weeks, carefully planned, with consultations from her legal team and trusted confidants. The palace, however, saw it differently. To them, this wasn't just a personal matter. It was a crisis that threatened to disrupt the carefully curated image of the monarchy. And within that tension, Harry was left stranded between his wife's independence and his brother's sense of duty. Now, here's where it gets even more intense. Blocking a family member, especially a brother, is not just a personal decision. It sends ripples throughout the palace. Courtiers, advisors, and staff are left scrambling, trying to interpret every move, every word, every silent moment. Who leaked what? Who knew what first? And most importantly, what does this say about the relationship between the two princes? The optics alone are enough to make palace insiders sweat. But the real story lies behind closed doors, in private conversations, in hushed whispers, in the weight of shared history now turned into tension. Imagine sitting on the other side of the line, listening to a dial tone that feels like rejection. That's what Harry felt. The desperation in his voice, the vulnerability that comes when a man pleads with someone he loves, someone he thought would protect him, was met with silence. And William? He wasn't just quiet. According to insiders, he took deliberate steps to ensure the request didn't reach the point of negotiation. It wasn't just a no. It was a definitive, deliberate, and coldly strategic blockade. the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty. Some might argue that William was right to prioritize the crown. After all, the British monarchy isn't a typical family business. It's an institution, a symbol, a centuries-old tradition with protocols that many of us can barely comprehend. The stakes are enormous. A single scandal can ripple across nations, affect the monarchy's reputation, and even influence public sentiment about the royal family. But here's the contradiction. In protecting the institution, William risked destroying the personal bond that mattered most. He gambled with family trust in a way that could never be fully repaired. And let's not forget the public. By this point, the world was already watching every move, every whisper. Social media chatter exploded the second rumors of a dispute leaked. Fans of the Sussexes took sides. Royal loyalists defended William. Analysts debated motives, strategies, and implications. Everyone had an opinion, but no one knew the intimate, raw truth. That truth, the private anguish of Harry, the complex decision-making of William, is what makes this story so gripping. So what does Harry do next? When the one person you hope will catch you refuses, where do you turn? Do you fight? Do you retreat? Or do you find a third path, one that risks scandal but preserves your dignity? This isn't just a story about a phone call. It's about decisions that can fracture a family, redefine public perception, and leave scars that may never fully heal. And the consequences are already unfolding, with advisors whispering about potential legal moves, private allies offering refuge, and the media poised to turn every small action into headline news. But here's the thing. While the public only sees the drama, the human story is far more compelling. Harry, despite his title and status, is at a crossroads that anyone could relate to. Rejection from someone you love, fear for your family, and the gut-wrenching choice between standing your ground and protecting those you care about. And William, despite his duty and position, faces his own dilemma: protect the crown or protect the brother. Neither choice is simple, and neither comes without cost. By now, you're probably asking, how did it come to this? How did two brothers, raised in the same household, with shared memories and mutual affection, reach a point where a simple request could be blocked without hesitation? That's the story we're about to unravel. Every call, every conversation, every emotion will be dissected. You'll hear about the advisors, the leaks, the public reaction, and the private anguish. You'll understand the stakes, the strategies, and the secrets that no headline has ever dared to reveal. And just when you think you have a sense of where this is going, the plot twists. The initial blockage was only the beginning. What followed was a cascade of decisions, confrontations, and revelations that no one saw coming. Allies emerged, plans shifted, and the emotional intensity escalated. It's a story about power, betrayal, love, and loyalty. Everything you expect from the royal family, amplified by modern scrutiny and personal stakes. But here's the question that hangs over everything. What would you do if your own family turned away at your moment of need? Could you forgive them? Could you understand them? Or would you feel, like Harry, that the betrayal cuts deeper than any public humiliation, any media smear, any legal maneuver? And this isn't hypothetical, it's real. And it's happening right now. And just as the tension reaches its peak, we have to pause and ask, what came next inside Buckingham? How did the palace react? Who whispered in whose ear? And what secret maneuver changed the course of this family drama forever? Because what happened after Harry's blocked plea wasn't just a personal reaction. It was a turning point that would set the stage for an entire chapter of the royal family's history. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when a private, personal decision ignites a firestorm that no one could have predicted? That's exactly what unfolded the moment Meghan Markle filed for divorce. On paper, it was a legal move, a formal statement of separation. But in reality, it was far more than that. It was the spark that reignited centuries of tension, resentment, and unspoken rivalry within one of the world's most scrutinized families. Imagine Harry sitting at a quiet table, the paperwork in front of him, the gravity of the decision pressing down like a physical weight. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about defining the future of his family, his reputation, and, ultimately, his own identity. Every signature, every clause in that filing, carried consequences far beyond the legal realm. And as soon as it was submitted, a ripple effect began. one that would touch everyone in the palace, from the queen herself to the youngest aides quietly observing the unfolding drama. Harry knew what he was doing. He had anticipated resistance, even backlash, from the palace. But nothing could have prepared him for the immediate personal fallout. Within hours, his private communications were buzzing, messages pinging with news of reactions, speculation, and gossip. The moment Meghan's filing became official, William's world shifted. And so did Harry's. What was supposed to be a controlled, personal step quickly spiraled into a public, emotional battleground. William, in particular, reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and protective instinct. To him, the divorce wasn't just a marital matter. It was a potential scandal that could shake the monarchy's reputation to its core. Yet, his response was measured, calculated, and, in many ways, chilling. There were no dramatic confrontations in public, no fiery statements to journalists, no glaring headlines released by the palace. Instead, the reaction was silent, deliberate, and designed to communicate one clear message: control the narrative. Protect the institution at all costs. And, in doing so, block the brother who had stepped outside the bounds of expectation. But what does it feel like to be on the receiving end of that control? Harry, who had endured relentless public scrutiny for years, suddenly faced a new kind of vulnerability, one born not from the press, but from family. He had expected resistance, yes. He had anticipated tension, but he hadn't expected the cold, strategic rejection that came with William's silent but decisive action. The message was clear: the monarchy's priorities come first. Blood ties? Secondary. Personal loyalty? Optional. This moment revealed the complex web of emotions and obligations that define life in the royal family. It's a world where every action is measured against centuries of precedent, where a single phone call can be dissected, analyzed, and turned into political theater, and where emotions are often considered liabilities, not assets. For Harry, this was a cruel paradox. He was fighting for personal freedom, personal safety, and personal dignity, but in doing so, he clashed with a system designed to suppress exactly those impulses. Meanwhile, Meghan's filing was more than just paperwork. It was a statement of autonomy, a declaration that she would no longer be constrained by expectations, gossip, or invisible boundaries dictated by palace tradition. And while this act of empowerment was celebrated by supporters, it sent shockwaves through the inner circle. Advisors scrambled to assess the fallout. Strategists calculated potential media narratives, and even distant family members began whispering in private corridors about the implications. Harry, standing at the intersection of loyalty to his wife and loyalty to his family, was suddenly caught in the eye of a storm he couldn't fully control. The emotional stakes were enormous. For Harry, the filing represented both a relief and a threat. Relief because it formalized a necessary step in reclaiming autonomy. Threat because it triggered the very real possibility of isolation from family, from tradition, from the stability he had relied upon for decades. The psychological weight was immense. Every decision, every conversation, every glance carried the tension of consequences that could ripple across years. And in that tension, the fissure between him and William widened. William's position, by contrast, was strategic. He understood the optics, the historical context, and the potential for public backlash. But there's a stark contradiction here. On the one hand, he was the protective older brother, someone who should have offered refuge, guidance, or at least understanding. On the other, he was a future king, responsible for the image, stability, and continuity of an institution that has survived for centuries. Balancing these two roles was nearly impossible, and yet, in that critical moment, William made a choice. And that choice would define the trajectory of the family drama for months to come. The palace itself became a pressure cooker. Courtiers whispered, aides took notes, and everyone involved tried to anticipate Harry's next move. Would he retaliate? Would he go public? Would he seek allies outside the palace walls? Every decision was a potential headline, every reaction a potential scandal. And in that environment, even small gestures, a lingering look, a withheld reply, a carefully worded statement, carried enormous weight. Meanwhile, Harry's personal emotions were escalating. There was anger, yes, but also profound sadness. The sense of betrayal ran deep. This wasn't just a disagreement over logistics or protocol. It was a fundamental clash of values and priorities. How could someone who shared so much history with him, someone he trusted implicitly, respond with such coldness at a moment of vulnerability? The question haunted him, lingering in every private conversation, every quiet reflection. And yet, even amidst the tension, Harry remained strategic. He understood that the world was watching, that every action could be amplified, and that public perception mattered as much as private reality. But strategy does not erase emotional pain. The sense of isolation, the sting of rejection, and the awareness that his brother's loyalty was conditional created an inner conflict that was impossible to ignore. Every decision became a balancing act between emotion and strategy, between vulnerability and survival. The fallout didn't end with Harry and William. Meghan's filing, coupled with the subsequent family reactions, created a media frenzy. Tabloids and social media exploded with speculation, commentary, and conjecture. Headlines screamed of betrayal, heartbreak, and palace intrigue. Fans and critics alike debated the morality, the optics, and the personal choices involved. Yet, amid the chaos, the private reality, the human reality, remained unseen. Harry's despair, William's calculated restraint, and Meghan's assertive independence were hidden behind layers of tradition, protocol, and public relations. And just as tensions reached a crescendo, another twist emerged. Sources close to the palace reported that the filing had triggered an unexpected chain of events. Emergency meetings, strategy sessions, and confidential communications aimed at containing both the emotional and public fallout. Advisors worked behind closed doors, attempting to craft a narrative that would minimize damage while still enforcing the boundaries set by tradition. And in these private corridors, decisions were being made that would alter the trajectory of Harry's life, William's perception, and Meghan's independence. For Harry, the filing was more than a legal step. It was a catalyst. It forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about family loyalty, personal responsibility, and the sometimes cold calculus of the monarchy. For William, it was a reminder that leadership often requires painful decisions, even when they clash with personal bonds. And for Meghan, it was an assertion of agency, a refusal to be constrained by expectation, and a bold statement of self-determination that would reverberate far beyond the palace walls. As the dust settled, though it was far from over, the emotional landscape of the royal family had shifted dramatically. Relationships were strained, alliances tested, and secrets threatened to surface. Every conversation, every glance, every unspoken word carried weight. And through it all, Harry remained at the center of a storm he had both anticipated and feared, caught between loyalty to family, love for his wife, and the unrelenting scrutiny of the world. But the question that lingered over every decision, every interaction, and every late-night conversation was simple yet profound. How would William respond? Would he rise to the role of brother, offering support and sanctuary in a moment of crisis? Or would he allow duty, tradition, and public perception to dictate his actions, leaving Harry to navigate the fallout alone? And the answer, when it came, was more shocking than anyone could have predicted, because what came next would not just define the immediate aftermath of the filing. It would set the stage for a confrontation, a series of emotional reckonings, and a family rift that might never fully heal. The palace has always been a world apart. Outside, it's a symbol of tradition, ceremony, and pomp, a glittering facade of golden gates, manicured gardens, and perfectly timed public appearances. But inside those ancient walls, the air is thick with tension, whispers, and the weight of centuries of protocol. And when Meghan Markle filed for divorce, that tension didn't just rise, it erupted. Have you ever wondered what really happens behind palace doors when the cameras aren't watching? When decisions are made that affect not just individuals, but an entire institution. It's a place where every word is calculated, every glance analyzed, and every gesture potentially historic. For Harry, that filing wasn't just a legal move. It was the opening of a door into a world he already knew was complicated, but now felt nearly impenetrable. From the moment the filing was confirmed, the palace atmosphere shifted. Courtiers whispered hurriedly in hallways. Advisors convened emergency meetings. The Queen, always a figure of calm, was said to have summoned her most trusted aides to assess the fallout. And in the background, the staff, those who managed the daily operations of the royal household, sensed the tension, even if they didn't understand its full scope. Every servant, aide, and advisor felt the weight of what was coming. It was as if the palace itself had taken a deep breath, bracing for impact. William's role was particularly complicated. He wasn't just a brother observing a personal crisis. He was the future king, the man expected to maintain the image, security, and dignity of the monarchy, while simultaneously managing the fallout from a private family matter now magnified for the world to see. That meant balancing emotions, tradition, and public perception, all while keeping a distance that felt cold, even calculated. It's a paradox. As the older sibling, he was expected to protect Harry. As the future monarch, he was expected to protect the crown. And in that delicate balance, personal loyalty often becomes the first casualty. One insider revealed that the palace operates like a chessboard. Every action is strategic. Every decision has consequences. And when Harry reached out for help, the move wasn't just ignored. It was intercepted and considered within the context of centuries of tradition. That's why William's response, or lack thereof, wasn't simply personal, it was institutional. The monarchy has survived precisely because it values order and image above individual emotion. But what happens when the individual at the center of the storm is your brother, someone you've grown up with, shared jokes with, fought with, and confided in? That's the question William faced behind closed doors. Meanwhile, Harry was experiencing his own private storm. He wasn't just dealing with the disappointment of being blocked. He was grappling with the realization that the rules of the palace extend even to blood relations. That moment, when he recognized that his brother would choose protocol over family, was pivotal. And it wasn't just the emotional sting. It was the awareness that his every move could now be scrutinized, judged, and weaponized in the court of public opinion. And then there were Meghan's allies. Those who supported her and Harry were already moving, quietly, behind the scenes. Legal advisors, close friends, and confidants were strategizing, trying to anticipate what the palace might do next. Was there a back channel that could be used? A way to reach William, to change his mind, to negotiate a temporary reprieve? These questions circulated in hushed tones, often in rooms away from the public eye, while the palace itself seemed almost frozen in anticipation. The palace isn't just a building, it's a living ecosystem. Every corridor, every office, every reception room has a history and a hierarchy. Decisions are rarely spontaneous. They're debated, analyzed, and filtered through layers of advisors and staff. And that's why Harry's blocked request wasn't a simple denial. It was a process. From the moment he reached out, his plea traveled through channels, assessed for risk, discussed in private meetings, and finally returned to him in the form of silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes. Have you ever felt that kind of rejection? Not just a casual no, but the deliberate kind that communicates distance, judgment, and consequence? That's what Harry experienced. And as the days passed, that silence was amplified by every glance, every avoided conversation, every subtle reference in conversations he overheard. The palace, always a place of elegance and control, had become a pressure cooker, and Harry was trapped in the center of it. Yet, even in this environment, contradictions abounded. William, for all his apparent coldness, was reportedly racked with internal conflict. Advisors noted moments where he seemed torn, his body language, his private conversations hinting at empathy, concern, even guilt. But the protocols, the advisors, and the weight of history always won out. That's the cruel irony of palace life. You can feel, but you must never show it. You can care, but duty often demands otherwise. And in this case, the conflict between heart and institution created a tension so palpable it seemed to seep into the walls themselves. Meanwhile, the public story was already beginning to unfold, even without official statements. Leaks, strategic or accidental, started appearing in tabloids. Pundits speculated about rifts, betrayals, and hidden confrontations. Social media erupted, with millions weighing in, offering judgment, support, or condemnation. For Harry, that external noise wasn't just background. It was part of the pressure, a constant reminder that his private pain had become public fodder. Inside the palace, the stakes escalated quickly. Some aides reportedly argued for a conciliatory approach, urging William to at least hear Harry out. Others insisted that the monarchy's reputation must remain untarnished, that no personal plea could override centuries of protocol. And so, even within William's own circle, tension simmered. Decisions weren't just about one brother blocking another. They were about how an entire institution would weather a storm of personal scandal, media scrutiny, and public perception. Harry, in the meantime, wasn't passive. Despite the blocked requests, he began quietly planning. He reached out to confidants, explored alternative options, and tried to anticipate the palace's next moves. Every action had to be measured, every conversation calculated, because one misstep could be seized upon and magnified. And yet, even as he strategized, the emotional toll was undeniable. The sting of rejection, the feeling of being shut out by someone he trusted implicitly, lingered in every decision, every private reflection, every sleepless night. And here's the twist. Despite the blockade, insiders hint that Harry never gave up hope entirely. Reports suggest that he believed there might still be a way to reach William, to remind him that family sometimes comes before protocol. But the palace, like a living organism, had already shifted. Gates had been closed, channels rerouted, and advisors had made it clear that the brotherly intervention would not be simple or welcome. Every attempt to bridge the gap now had to navigate layers of bureaucracy, layers of history, and layers of human emotion. Meanwhile, Meghan's team worked in parallel. Every move she made, every public statement, and every private communication was weighed for impact. They understood the stakes not just legally but emotionally, and they sought to protect Harry while also asserting Meghan's autonomy. The strategy was delicate: support without inflaming, protect without provoking, and communicate without compromising. And in this intricate dance, the palace's silence loomed like a shadow, a constant reminder of the obstacles standing in their way. Even as these events unfolded, there was an undercurrent of irony. The very institution designed to protect family, legacy, and tradition was now a source of isolation and conflict. The palace, with all its grandeur, history, and protocol, had become a labyrinth, with walls both physical and emotional that Harry could not breach. And in that labyrinth, every conversation, every movement, every decision carried amplified meaning. The question that haunted everyone inside those walls was simple yet terrifying. How far would this rift go? Could it be healed? Or had the combination of divorce filing, blocked pleas, and institutional pressure created a chasm too wide to cross? And while these questions circulated, the world outside watched, speculated, and judged, unaware of the full, intricate web of decisions, emotions, and secrets at play. But just as the tension reached a fever pitch, the palace dynamics introduced a new variable, one that no one outside could have predicted. A confidential report leaked to the inner circle suggested that William had made a calculated move that went beyond simple rejection. It wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, but it had the potential to change everything. A decision had been made, behind palace doors, that would force Harry, Meghan, and the advisors into a confrontation no one was fully prepared for. Because what came next would not just reveal the personal stakes. It would expose the palace itself, showing cracks in an institution long thought impenetrable and challenging everything the world believed about loyalty, family, and duty. And just when you thought you understood the drama, the walls themselves seemed to whisper, "Nothing here is as it seems." But what happened next inside Buckingham would escalate tensions in ways no one saw coming, and the fallout would reach far beyond private walls. What do you do when the person you trust most, the person who knows your fears, your hopes, and your deepest vulnerabilities, turns away at the exact moment you need them? That was the question haunting Prince Harry as he made what would become one of the most desperate calls of his life. A plea for help, for sanctuary, for understanding, and for family. And yet, the response he received was far from the reassurance he had hoped for. It all began quietly, in a small, private moment far from the glare of public attention. Harry, emotionally drained and mentally exhausted from the weeks of tension following Meghan's divorce filing, felt a singular need to be close to family. Not for headlines, not for appearances, but for the comfort that comes from being with someone who knows you, someone whose love feels unconditional. He dialed William's number, his hands trembling slightly, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. It was a simple request, or so he thought, a place to stay in the United Kingdom. But that simplicity was deceptive. What seemed like a small, personal request was anything but. In the palace, every word, every call, every gesture is filtered through layers of advisors, protocol, and centuries of tradition. Harry's call, however private it was meant to be, was inevitably intercepted, analyzed, and assessed for risk. William, poised between his role as a brother and his responsibility as future king, made a decision. The call would not result in welcome. The plea would be blocked, a wall of silence erected between them. Can you imagine the feeling? The vulnerability of reaching out, only to be met with nothing but quiet denial? For Harry, the emotional impact was immediate. He had anticipated resistance, perhaps even hesitation, but he hadn't expected this cold, strategic rejection. It was one thing to disagree, to offer counsel, to express concern. It was another entirely to actively block the request, to prevent dialogue, to send the unmistakable message: "We will not meet you here. You will not cross this threshold." In those first moments, Harry felt a wave of disbelief, followed quickly by frustration, and then a profound sadness. He had always relied on William in moments of uncertainty. They had shared experiences, childhood memories, and the kind of bond only siblings can understand. And yet, in this critical moment, that bond seemed fractured beyond repair. Every instinct in Harry's body screamed for connection, for a shared understanding, for the reassurance that comes from family support. And yet, the palace's protocols, and William's choice to prioritize duty over brotherhood, rendered that instinct almost meaningless. It was during these moments of isolation that Harry's mind raced. He remembered past moments of guidance from William, the small gestures of encouragement, the shared jokes, the quiet support that had often carried him through difficult times. And now, the absence of those gestures was deafening. The silence of his brother became a tangible presence, pressing down on him, amplifying the anxiety, amplifying the loneliness, and igniting a sense of betrayal he could not ignore. And yet, in the midst of this emotional storm, Harry remained strategic. He was not a man who reacted impulsively, at least not publicly. Every move he made, every word he spoke, and every conversation he initiated was weighed for potential impact. He knew that the world was watching. Every call could become a headline. Every plea could become fodder for speculation. And still, despite the risk, he made the call. Because sometimes, the need for family outweighs caution. Sometimes, human emotion cannot be contained by protocol, by public image, or by centuries of expectation. What Harry could not anticipate, however, was the intensity of the palace's reaction. The moment the blocked plea became known to advisors, whispers began circulating in hallways and offices. Courtiers debated whether William had overstepped, whether Harry's request should have been entertained, and how this incident might affect public perception. Behind closed doors, the tension was palpable. Some aides advocated for compromise, urging William to reconsider, to allow a private reconciliation. Others argued that the monarchy's image must remain untarnished, that protocol and duty must take precedence over individual sentiment. The palace, in essence, became a battleground of competing loyalties and hidden agendas. But even as the strategic considerations unfolded, the human drama was undeniable. Harry's emotional state was fragile, heightened by the stress of divorce, public scrutiny, and the feeling of being isolated from the one person he believed would understand. Every unanswered call, every delayed message, every sign of avoidance deepened his sense of despair. And yet, he could not allow the frustration to paralyze him. He needed answers, he needed clarity, and above all, he needed some form of family support, even if that meant navigating the complexities of palace politics. As the days wore on, Harry attempted multiple channels of communication. Messages were sent, private intermediaries were consulted, and trusted allies attempted to negotiate. Each attempt, however, was met with resistance or polite deflection. It became increasingly clear that William's decision was deliberate, considered, and unlikely to be reversed. The sense of isolation grew, and with it, the emotional stakes escalated. What makes this plea so compelling and so heart-wrenching is the paradox Harry faced. On one hand, He was reaching out for help from someone he loved and trusted. On the other, he had to navigate a world where that love was secondary to protocol, perception, and duty. It is a tension few of us can truly comprehend. The need for human connection weighed against centuries of expectation and the crushing weight of public scrutiny. And yet, the story doesn't end with blocked calls and silenced pleas. Because when Harry realized that his brother would not respond in the way he hoped, he began to contemplate more extreme measures. Private allies reported that he considered every possible avenue, some diplomatic, some strategic, and some that carried real risk of public exposure. Every option was weighed against the potential consequences for both his family and his own sense of integrity. The emotional stakes had become intertwined with tactical considerations, creating a scenario that was both intensely personal and inescapably political. Meanwhile, the media began to sense the tension even before official statements were made. Social media accounts speculated on the brothers' relationship, tabloids hinted at rifts, and commentators analyzed body language from past public appearances, interpreting each as a signal of conflict or estrangement. The scrutiny, though external, intensified the pressure on Harry. Not only was he navigating personal rejection, but he also had to consider how every private action could be interpreted in the court of public opinion. And yet, through all of this, one theme remained constant: the human need for connection. Harry's plea was not about power, status, or headlines. It was about something far more fundamental: the desire to be seen, to be heard, to be supported by someone who knows you intimately. And that need, when met with silence, is profoundly destabilizing. It forces reflection, anger, sadness, and eventually, a determination to find alternative solutions, no matter how complex or fraught. What makes this moment even more dramatic is the emotional layering. Harry's frustration was compounded by guilt. Guilt over asking for help, guilt over the perceived burden he placed on his brother, and guilt over the public spectacle that might ensue if the situation escalated. Simultaneously, there was an undercurrent of fear. Fear that the blockade signaled a permanent fracture, that reconciliation might not be possible, and that the personal cost of navigating palace protocol could outweigh any benefit of familial connection. And yet, in the midst of despair, there was a spark of defiance. Harry was not a man accustomed to passivity. He understood that if the door was closed, he might have to find another way in, or create his own path forward. It was a tension that combined desperation with strategy, vulnerability with determination, and human emotion with calculated planning. The drama, in other words, was far from over. And here is the critical point. Harry's desperate plea did not just test his brother's patience or the monarchy's protocols. It exposed the very fragility of human relationships under the weight of tradition, expectation, and scrutiny. It revealed that even the most structured institutions are vulnerable when confronted with raw emotion. And it set the stage for a confrontation that would ripple through the palace, the media, and the public consciousness for months to come. So what did Harry do next? How did he respond to the silence, the subtle rebuffs, and the emotional coldness? And how did William's actions, or inactions, shape the path forward? Because the next step in this story would not only define the personal dynamic between the brothers, it would also ignite a sequence of events that no one inside or outside the palace could have anticipated. And just as tension reached its peak, a revelation emerged that threatened to change everything. But what came next would push the relationship to its breaking point, and no one saw it coming. What if the very act of asserting independence could ignite a firestorm so intense that it threatens not only your personal life, but the delicate balance of an entire institution? That's exactly what happened the moment Meghan Markle filed for divorce. On paper, it was a legal move, a formal separation. In reality, it was a seismic shift, one that challenged centuries of royal tradition, exposed deep familial fractures, and set in motion a chain reaction that no one could fully anticipate. Meghan's strategy wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, carefully planned, and executed with precision. Sources close to her describe weeks of preparation leading up to the filing. Legal advisors were consulted, communications were rehearsed, and every potential outcome was meticulously assessed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision fueled by emotion. It was a calculated act designed to protect her autonomy while simultaneously challenging the constraints imposed by the monarchy. But that doesn't mean it was easy. The emotional stakes were immense. Filing for divorce is never a neutral act, especially when you are a public figure whose every move is scrutinized. Meghan had to weigh the personal ramifications against the public consequences. How would the world react? How would the palace respond? How would Harry, her husband, process the filing? Each of these questions carried profound weight, and the answers were anything but clear. From the moment the filing became official, it sent shockwaves through the royal household. Advisors scrambled to assess the legal implications, strategists calculated media narratives, and the inner circle of the monarchy braced for what was widely understood to be a highly sensitive situation. Meghan's move challenged not just the personal relationship between her and Harry, but the entire balance of the institution. It was a stark reminder that, despite appearances, the royal family is not immune to the forces of modern law, personal agency, and strategic assertiveness. Harry, of course, felt the immediate impact. While he had anticipated tension, the reality of the filing amplified every personal and emotional strain he was already experiencing. He was caught between loyalty to Meghan and loyalty to the family he had grown up with, between his desire for privacy and the inescapable glare of public scrutiny. And in the midst of all this, his desperate plea to William for support had already been blocked, leaving him emotionally isolated and forced to navigate a highly complex situation almost entirely on his own. The filing itself was strategic in ways most people wouldn't immediately recognize. It was timed, carefully worded, and designed to assert independence without unnecessarily escalating public conflict. Meghan's legal team reportedly advised on the exact language, the timing of announcements, and the sequence of public disclosures. Every detail mattered, because in the palace, perception is as critical as reality. A misstep could be exploited, misinterpreted, or weaponized against them. Yet, even with all the strategy, the human element remained unpredictable. Emotions, past grievances, and personal relationships don't always align neatly with legal strategy. Meghan's filing created immediate ripples of tension not only within the palace hierarchy, but also within Harry's own support network. Friends and confidants had to balance loyalty, discretion, and strategic guidance. They became part of a shadow battlefield, navigating the complex interplay of family dynamics, legal considerations, and public perception. The palace, predictably, reacted with caution, if not outright alarm. While there was no public outburst, the internal machinery of the institution went into overdrive. Emergency meetings were convened. Trusted aides briefed the Queen and senior members. Communications teams worked tirelessly to assess potential leaks, manage public narratives, and craft responses that would minimize reputational damage. The filing wasn't just a personal matter. It had become a structural crisis. For Harry, the stakes were intensely personal. He understood that the filing was necessary, that it was a step toward securing both his and Meghan's independence. But the emotional toll was undeniable. His bond with William was already strained. The palace had effectively blocked his attempt to seek solace or temporary refuge. And now, the legal proceedings were adding another layer of complexity, threatening to widen the emotional and familial chasm even further. What makes Meghan's approach remarkable is her awareness of these overlapping pressures. She didn't act impulsively. She acted strategically, balancing emotion with foresight, personal need with public consequence. Her goal was not to attack the monarchy, nor to publicly humiliate her husband or brother-in-law. Instead, it was to assert a clear boundary. She would not be constrained by expectation, tradition, or silent compliance. She would claim agency in a world where control is tightly managed and independence is rarely fully permitted. And yet, the palace was far from passive. Advisors immediately began analyzing the filing, identifying potential vulnerabilities, and crafting defensive strategies. Legal considerations were paramount. How would the filing affect public perception, royal assets, and international relations? Every angle was scrutinized. Every possible consequence was debated in private, with aides and courtiers balancing loyalty, tradition, and pragmatic risk management. And throughout this process, Harry's blocked request loomed like a shadow, a reminder of the growing tension between personal need and institutional priority. Interestingly, Meghan's strategy also involved media control. Unlike in past royal controversies, where leaks were often opportunistic, this time her team carefully controlled the narrative. Insider sources indicate that every statement, every communication, and every potential interview was premeditated. The goal was simple: protect the couple's autonomy, maintain dignity, and avoid unnecessary escalation, while still ensuring that their perspective reached the public before rumors or misinterpretations could take hold. But even the best-laid plans cannot fully contain human emotion. The filing intensified underlying tensions between Harry and William. Advisors, allies, and confidants all reported increased private friction. Conversations became charged with unspoken accusations, emotional outbursts were narrowly avoided, and every interaction carried the risk of further estrangement. The personal and the institutional collided in a way that was both inevitable and unavoidable. For Harry, the filing represented both liberation and danger. It liberated him from a legal and emotional constraint, allowing him to assert agency alongside Meghan. Yet it also created a new danger: heightened scrutiny, blocked family support, and escalating tension within the palace. The filing was both a shield and a spotlight, protecting personal autonomy while illuminating vulnerabilities that had previously been private. And then there's the human irony. In asserting independence, Meghan's action unintentionally placed Harry in an even more precarious position with his family. The very act intended to secure their autonomy also forced Harry to confront the stark reality of familial distance and the limits of brotherly loyalty. It was a paradox. A legal filing meant to protect personal freedom simultaneously exposed emotional fracture, isolation, and vulnerability. As the days passed, Meghan's strategy unfolded further. Legal maneuvers, private communications, and careful timing of public statements all worked in tandem to create a controlled narrative. Yet, despite this meticulous planning, the personal cost remained high. Harry had to navigate a labyrinth of family tension, public attention, and emotional isolation. And William, steadfast in his duties, remained a figure both present and absent, structurally involved in the unfolding drama, but personally distant in the moments Harry needed him most. And this is where the story begins to twist further. Advisors reported that the filing triggered a series of behind-the-scenes communications that were previously unseen. Secret meetings were convened. Intermediaries were deployed. Confidential messages were exchanged. Every move was calculated to anticipate reactions, mitigate risk, and protect institutional stability. And through it all, the human element, the emotional weight, the sense of betrayal, the longing for connection, remained a constant undercurrent, impossible to suppress entirely. But just as Meghan's strategy appeared calculated and controlled, a new variable emerged, one that threatened to upend every carefully laid plan. A leak, subtle yet explosive, revealed private details of Harry's attempts to reach William. The blocked request, once hidden, became a point of speculation. The media and public seized upon it immediately. Suddenly, the very act meant to preserve autonomy was entwined with personal conflict, casting both Harry and Meghan into a storm of scrutiny neither fully anticipated. At this point, the stakes were no longer purely personal. They were institutional, emotional, and public simultaneously. The divorce filing was no longer a private matter. It was a catalyst that revealed the underlying fractures within the royal family, exposed the limits of personal loyalty, and challenged the palace's ability to manage both emotion and optics. And so, as the dust settled, one question loomed large. How would Harry respond to this intensified pressure? How would he navigate the complex interplay of family rejection, public attention, and the need to protect Meghan? And more importantly, what would William do next, knowing the full impact of the filing and the emotional plea that had been blocked? Because the next move in this intricate drama would push all parties to their limits, setting the stage for confrontations, emotional reckonings, and revelations that no one outside, or even inside, the palace could have predicted. But what came next would escalate the rift between the brothers in ways that shocked even the most seasoned palace insiders, and no one saw it coming. What happens when love, loyalty, and duty collide in the most public way imaginable? That is the impossible position William found himself in after Meghan Markle filed for divorce and Harry's desperate pleas were blocked. To the outside world, He was the calm, composed future king, the elder brother poised to uphold centuries of tradition. But inside, the emotional and ethical stakes were far more complicated and far more personal. William's world has always been defined by responsibility. From childhood, he was groomed not just to lead, but to embody the monarchy itself. Every decision, every public gesture, every statement carries weight beyond comprehension. And now, in the middle of a family crisis intensified by divorce filings and blocked pleas, William was forced to navigate a treacherous terrain where emotion and duty were at odds. At first glance, his response appears cold. Blocking Harry, maintaining distance, prioritizing protocol over personal connection. These are actions that seem calculated, almost mechanical. But insiders say it wasn't that simple. William was torn between two competing forces, the instinct to protect the crown and the instinct to protect his brother. Every conversation he had behind palace doors reflected that tension. Advisors watched closely, noting moments when William hesitated, when his body language betrayed uncertainty, when private comments hinted at regret. The stakes were enormous. Allowing Harry to stay, to take refuge within the UK, risked public scrutiny, leaked narratives, and perceived favoritism. The monarchy's image, carefully curated over generations, was fragile. Even minor deviations could be blown into international headlines. And yet, to deny Harry, someone he loved, someone he had grown up with, was to inflict a personal wound, one that could redefine their relationship permanently. William's inner conflict can only be understood in the context of monarchy culture. Emotion is often suppressed, loyalty to the institution valued above personal relationships. The ideal royal acts with restraint, never publicly reveals weakness, and places the crown above all else. For William, every private choice was measured against centuries of precedent. But what happens when precedent clashes with family loyalty? That is the dilemma he faced. Sources report that William spent hours in private reflection after the divorce filing, weighing consequences, analyzing options, and anticipating public reaction. Every possible scenario, allowing Harry to stay, negotiating behind the scenes, or blocking him completely, was examined in detail. Each carried emotional cost and institutional risk. And every option, insiders say, left William feeling trapped between the roles of brother and future king. The palace advisors leaned heavily on the institutional perspective. They emphasized the importance of public image, historical precedent, and controlled communication. They urged caution, suggested subtle redirection, and discouraged personal intervention. For William, this created a dynamic tension. Listen to advisors and risk emotional estrangement, or override guidance and risk scrutiny, speculation, and potential scandal. The decision was agonizing. And yet, despite the calculated exterior, William's personal emotions were in turmoil. There were moments when frustration, regret, and even guilt surfaced. Privately, he reportedly acknowledged that blocking Harry might cause irreparable harm to their brotherhood. He understood that the very act of upholding protocol could inflict deep emotional wounds. But the monarchy, by design, doesn't allow for simple resolutions rooted in emotion. Duty and family were in conflict, and William's sense of responsibility tilted the scale toward duty. Interestingly, William's perspective also included a strategic element, the awareness that Harry's actions were not isolated. They were intertwined with Meghan's assertive independence, the divorce filing, and the potential media fallout. William had to consider how his response would affect the broader narrative. Allowing Harry to stay might have been perceived as support for Meghan, which could complicate the monarchy's image, feeding speculation about internal fractures. Denying him, though painful, allowed the palace to maintain control over the story. But this choice was far from easy. Behind closed doors, William reportedly wrestled with the emotional consequences. Advisors noted moments of hesitation, private conversations tinged with regret, and subtle gestures that hinted at the internal conflict. For the future king, the personal and the institutional were not easily separable. Every decision carried multiple layers of impact, blending family loyalty, public duty, and personal conscience into a complex, high-stakes calculus. Meanwhile, Harry's persistent attempts to connect intensified William's dilemma. Every blocked call, every unanswered plea, Every private communication forced him to confront a stark reality, that the bond with his brother might be irreparably strained. The palace, usually insulated from emotional chaos, now became a crucible of tension, where strategic decisions collided with personal history. William was not only making choices for the monarchy, he was shaping the emotional landscape of his family, with consequences that would last decades. There's also a human irony at play. William's decision to block Harry, designed to protect both the crown and the family's image, inadvertently created more tension, more emotional vulnerability, and more personal risk. It highlighted the paradox at the heart of the royal family. The very institution that demands loyalty and sacrifice often complicates the simplest human relationships. William's adherence to duty, while strategically sound, created a rift that threatened to redefine his relationship with his brother permanently. And yet, amidst the turmoil, William remained composed in public. He continued official duties, attended engagements, and presented a calm, controlled exterior. This duality, personal conflict hidden behind a polished public persona, is a hallmark of the monarchy, but it comes at a significant cost. Privately, the emotional weight is immense, as every gesture and decision is scrutinized internally and externally. The tension escalated as advisors began discussing possible interventions. Some suggested indirect communication, intermediaries who could bridge the gap between the brothers without compromising public perception. Others argued for strict boundaries, emphasizing the importance of maintaining protocol above personal emotion. William, caught between these approaches, faced a decision that would have far-reaching implications, not just for Harry and Meghan, but for the monarchy as a whole. And there's a psychological dimension that outsiders rarely see. Being the future king is not just a role, it's a psychological framework that shapes every decision. Every choice is filtered through centuries of expectation, duty, and precedent. For William, this created a unique tension. The instinct to protect a loved one versus the ingrained imperative to uphold the institution. The clash between these forces is not theoretical. It's lived, felt, and agonized over in moments of private reflection. Meanwhile, Harry's situation was becoming increasingly urgent. Reports from private sources suggest that the emotional strain, coupled with blocked access to his brother, forced him to consider alternative plans. The stakes were no longer just familial. They were legal, strategic, and emotional simultaneously. William's choices directly shaped the landscape Harry had to navigate, highlighting the profound interconnection between personal relationships and institutional imperatives. The irony deepens when we consider the public perception. To the world, William appeared steady, measured, and in control. Behind palace walls, however, the emotional calculus was far more complicated. Every choice, every pause, every gesture carried layers of meaning and consequence. The future king was balancing emotion, duty, and public image in real time, under intense scrutiny and in an unprecedented family crisis. And yet, despite the careful planning, there were cracks. Private conversations, subtle emotional cues, and leaked reports hinted at William's internal struggle. The advisor's strategic guidance could only do so much. It could not erase the human dimension of brotherhood, shared history, and familial loyalty. Every decision weighed heavily. Every silence was pregnant with meaning, and every blocked plea became a psychological battlefield. As tensions reached a tipping point, William faced a pivotal question. Should he maintain absolute protocol at the cost of his brother's trust and emotional well-being? Or should he risk public scrutiny, institutional criticism, and potential scandal to act as a brother first, a future king second? The decision was not just about family. It was about legacy, perception, and the delicate equilibrium of the monarchy itself. And then came the revelation that would redefine the stakes. Sources indicate that, behind the carefully closed doors of Buckingham, William made a choice that was more consequential than anyone could have predicted. It wasn't public, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried seismic implications. This move would force Harry to respond, compel Meghan's team to adjust strategy, and set the stage for a confrontation that would leave the palace and the public reeling. Because the next move would not just test brotherly loyalty, it would challenge the very foundations of duty, trust, and family bonds within one of the most famous families in the world. And just when the tension seemed unbearable, the palace's silence began to speak louder than any statement, leaving everyone involved on the brink of a revelation no one saw coming. What happens when a private family crisis becomes a public spectacle, magnified by the relentless gaze of global media? That was the reality Harry and Meghan faced as the divorce filing and blocked pleas transformed from a personal drama into an international story. The palace, with its centuries of tradition and careful image management, suddenly found itself in a whirlwind it could not fully control. From the moment Meghan's filing became official, the media began spinning narratives at an unprecedented pace. Headlines screamed of betrayal, rifts, and palace intrigue. The story was irresistible. Two brothers, one of them a future king, caught in a conflict amplified by divorce, loyalty, and secrecy. Every outlet had a take. Every social media account speculated. And Harry and Meghan, already navigating personal and legal complexity, were thrust into a maelstrom of public opinion.